Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm very happy to be here. I know very little about Ambedkar, so forgive me. Fortunately, I'm not supposed to speak about him today, but to speak on the general ideas. My understanding is that Ambedkar stated that without addressing the issue of caste, an economic and political revolution will be impossible. And I think that what we're seeing and what I'm supposed to be addressing today is the very clear fact that in the United States, we have no alternative but to address the issue of racial oppression, or there will be no revolution here. And vice versa, without defeating racial oppression, or there will be no defeat of racial oppression without a political revolution and without transformation of the private property system. My understanding is that racism is similar to caste in that it's a political and ideological or religious concept that's used for the rule by one class over another. And race, like caste, and this is actually one of the least understood concepts, I'm speaking in America, that like class, race does not exist as a biological or scientific category. There's one race, which is the human race. And this is a lie that has undergirded the history of racism since its beginning, and it continues today. I mean, there was even a case which you may have heard about where Elizabeth Warren went to get a DNA test because she was accused by Donald Trump of not being a Cherokee when she claimed that she was. So the idea that your race can be determined by a DNA test is wrong on the face of it, yet she went ahead and took this test and claimed that it proved she was a Cherokee, and the Cherokees themselves said, no, not at all. Membership in our tribe is determined by our tribal councils, whether they know you, what they think about you, what your history in relation to the tribe. Membership in the tribe has nothing to do with race or with DNA. And so it just goes to show, whether it comes from Donald Trump or Elizabeth Warren, race has nothing to do with biology. It has to do with economics and politics, and it uses identifiable characteristics of human beings for political purposes. I got involved in this probably years ago. I was raised as a Quaker, which in America that has a very unusual history and actually a very revolutionary history. The Quakers were a religious group that came out of England during the English Revolution in the 1640s. And they came to America with an extreme, I guess the word for it is an extreme love for democracy and equality and the concept of social equality, which they brought out of that revolutionary process. And even though most Quakers never lived up to it, the Quakers have always had a radical fringe which has insisted on it. That radical fringe led to people like, for example, Thomas Paine, who was the great writer of the American Revolution and wrote the book Common Sense. And it was based on the idea of what he called of human rights. Thomas Paine actually originated the concept of human rights. It was, back in his day, it was called the rights of man. Of course, today we use the more politically correct term, which is human rights. And that spread all over the world as a result of that process. And Thomas Paine was raised as a Quaker. His father was a Quaker, although he never claimed Quakerism himself. I get a sense of that love of equality and that love of democracy from his writings, which has existed ever since. And then Quakers played a huge role in the Abolitionist movement. Quakers fought with John Brown to free the slaves in West Virginia. And that's kind of the heritage where When I grew up, I became very radical, very revolutionary, and I had no idea why, so I had to go back and study my heritage, and that's where it came from. There's a statement by Marx which really explains the question of race in the United States very clearly, and he wrote this back just during or immediately after the Civil War. He said, "Labor in the white skin can never free itself as long as labor in the black skin is branded." And the whole concept of race actually originated during the time of what some people refer to as war capitalism. Sven Beckert wrote a book called The Empire of Cotton, which is an excellent book dealing with the worldwide cotton industry. And he uses the term war capitalism to describe that time in history when the slave trade began, when slavery began to be introduced during the conquest of Latin America and North America. And prior to that time, the term race didn't even exist. It said, difficult as it may be to imagine, society was not always divided according to racial categories. Race and racism are special products of the capitalist era. For a long time, humans were bounded by tribal affiliations or by religious allegiance. As nations sought to expand their wealth through overseas exploration, conquest, plunder, and colonial exploitation, the concept of race and nation became irretrievably bound up with the domination, conquest, and exploitation of not just so-called inferior peoples, but inferior peoples of color. The spread of the concept of race was inseparably connected to the conquest of the Americas and the spread of African slavery. The wider the spread of African slavery, the wider the spread of the concept of race. The sugar and cotton plantations of the Americas required acres of land and thousands of workers. The African slave trade to the Americas originally developed to meet these labor needs, but the trade itself quickly became a source of unheard of profits. Labor costs were sliced to the bone. Human beings became a commodity on the world market alongside the sugar and the cotton that they produced. These profits laid the foundations for the development of the capitalist economic system throughout the entire world. And the slave trade is generally regarded as the greatest crime in human history. Some 20 to 40 million people were brought on what they called the Middle Passage. They were put in ships. There's actually a fairly good depiction of them in the movies called Amistad, which is the history of a slave rebellion on the ship Amistad. The brutality, the inhumanity, and the murderousness of the system. And what was particular to the American slave system was the fact that it was chattel slavery, that there was no rights whatsoever given to the slaves, and the slaves were in fact treated as commodities. So the entire concept of race didn't exist prior to about 1500, and it began to be used after 1500, and in fact Europeans never called themselves Europeans until that time, and the whole concept of the white race didn't exist until it developed in relationship to the African slave trade. Now, the development of racism as an ideology in the United States, it was tied to the fact that our government was started by what was essentially a settler regime or settler colonialism, which was based on a war with the native peoples in North America. And it was also based on slavery. And originally slavery in the 1600s was a complement to the system of white indentured servitude. And as time went on through the 1600s, African slavery became more profitable due to the fact that slaves could be more intensely exploited and also due to the profits that came out of the slave trade. And in the 1600s and 1700s, there was a spontaneous tendency toward unity between the Africans and the white servants. And it expressed itself in numerous rebellions, and some of them, like most famously, there was a Bacon's Rebellion in 1670 or something, and where whites and Africans actually fought side by side. But there were also numerous other different rebellions against the colonial government. And so in response to this, a lot of our so-called founding fathers developed a means of institutionalizing racial privileges in a way to prevent this kind of unity from happening. For example, they created a system of privileges for whites, including legal rights and service contracts, rights to land, rights for artisans, rights for small farmers, and all of these were denied to Africans. At the same time, strict slave codes were enacted, which established the rights of slave owners, established plantation justice, and laws against intermarriage were introduced. And finally, the United States Constitution in 1787 actually enshrined the right to property above including the right to own human beings. And and even today you find conservatives who say that's the most important principle in the United States Constitution, and that's more important than what we call human rights. And it also institutionalized, people may be familiar with what was called the 3/5 clause, which stated that Africans counted as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of political representation, and that 3/5 vote for each African American wasn't cast by the slaves themselves, it was cast by their owner in order to perpetuate slavery. And actually that 3/5 law became one of the most contentious factors leading up to the Civil War in the United States. And basically, as going strictly by what they would call a strict constructionist of the Constitution, led to things like the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court in 1857, which said an African had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. So all of this economic and political explanation required an ideological and moral justification. And the planters used the biblical story of Noah and Ham as a religious justification for enslaving Africans. And that's some of the parallels which I can see to my understanding of the way the caste system is based in certain religious texts or historical religious views, and it ends up being used to justify economic exploitation. And this was supplemented by the so-called American school of pseudoscience before Civil War, and actually that whole tradition of pseudoscience, which states that the white race is superior to the black race, has continued and continues up to the present day. We have modern books like The Bell Curve, which attempt to prove that African Americans are intellectually inferior. And most racist theories held that white and colored races actually developed entirely separately, in spite of the fact that the science of evolution has showed to us that human beings were all evolved out of Africa, we're all descended from Africa. Racism was reinforced by the enormous economic expansion of slavery after the 1790s. There was some talk that even if you read the writings of Jefferson acts like he's almost ashamed of slavery, as he should have been. But after 1800, the expansion of slavery became so great, and the wealth that was accumulated by slavery became so great that after that time, nobody ever questioned slavery again, that was directly involved with it in the South. And there was a famous senator named Calhoun who actually said slavery was not just a necessary evil, it was a positive good. So all of this led up to the Civil War, which came as a result of the fact that the northern industrial system couldn't coexist with slavery, and because of the politics of the situation in the North, there were twice as many, the population was twice as large as the South. The South couldn't continue to expand and create enough slave states to sustain slavery without running into conflicts with the North, and that led to the Civil War. And the Civil War, in spite of the fact that it was between two wings of the capitalist class, was nevertheless one of the greatest revolutions in human history. And Garrison, who was the great abolitionist Garrison, often responded to critics of Abraham Lincoln because some of the abolitionists thought Abraham Lincoln was too hesitant, too slow, too insufficiently committed or whatever. But Garrison always responded, well, you can call him whatever you will, but he struck the chains off of 4 million slaves. And that's the truth. He led that process that led to that result. But because it was a revolution of capitalists against capitalists, it couldn't establish real freedom, and it couldn't end racial oppression. There wasn't a sufficiently strong enough movement of white and black farmers and workers at that time that was capable of demanding the 40 and sustaining the demand for the 40 acres and a mule out of the lands that were confiscated from the former plantation owners. And instead, the northern industrial and financial capital used the destruction of the southern planters to buy up southern land. And the whole spontaneous, what they did is they replaced the slave plantation system with a sharecropping system, which was almost as oppressive and almost as bad. There was even in that situation, though, there was still a spontaneous tendency toward unity, which arose during the 1870s through the 1890s, and it was called the Populist Movement. And even though there were racists among the populace, there was people understood the necessity for white and black farmers to unite, and they had a farmers alliance, and they actually had a colored alliance, which had millions of farmers, and they coordinated their activities. And partly as a result of this, the ruling class instituted what we now call Jim Crow, which was a fascist form of rule. They had a series of what they called Negro disenfranchisement votes in every southern state, starting in Mississippi in 1890, and one state after another passed these laws which disenfranchised African Americans. And it established a system of complete rule by terror and terroristic methods, such as lynchings. There was a lynching, 1 to 2 lynchings every week in the South in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And all of this was built on a system of what was called the Convict Lease, which was there's a book about it. It's called Slavery by Another Name, which shows that people who were convicted for the most minor crimes or the most minor violations were rounded up, shipped to prisons, and sentenced to, for example, dig in the coal mines near Birmingham, and under the most horrible, nauseating conditions, where people compared it to actual slavery and said at least under actual slavery, the owner had an incentive to try to keep the slave healthy enough that they could continue to work, whereas under the system of the convict lease, people were literally worked to death. And this implementation of Jim Crow and terrorism in the South was condoned by the North, and most famously by the progressive movement. It was especially condoned by Woodrow Wilson, who made a a reputation as a great progressive and a great Democrat in the early 20th century, but he actually reintroduced segregation into Washington, D.C., and presided over the growth of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 20th century. And segregation actually spread as a system at that time all over the North. There's another important book, it's called by Richard Rothstein. It's called The Color of Law, which shows, beginning in the 20th century, all over the North, the entire country in the urban areas was deliberately segregated by the government in order to prevent any unity between African American workers and white workers. The civil rights movement that we're familiar with was really impelled by the introduction of the mechanical cotton picker in the South, it was introduced in the 1940s, and it effectively undermined the entire sharecropping system and drove African Americans off the land and into the cities, both in the North and the South. The Great Migration, which you may be familiar with, from the South and of African Americans into the cities actually began earlier than that. It began around the time of World War I, but it was greatly increased by this end of sharecropping in the area right after World War II. And this fueled the emergence of the civil rights movement, because prior to that time, African Americans tended to be isolated in rural areas and relatively defenseless. But when they became concentrated in some of the major cities like Montgomery, Birmingham, they began to get a sense of their strength and a sense of the idea that if they united and they worked together, their numbers gave them the ability to launch a social and a political movement. And the civil rights movement proved that that was true. Another factor which is important, which is not very well known and which is generally suppressed in the history, is that the Communist Party played an important role in the early origins of the civil rights movement. And there's a good movie, it's called The Great Debaters. It's a Denzel Washington movie, which actually shows that history, how a communist, as a teacher, as a relatively obscure teacher, played an instrumental role in introducing the ideas of equality and freedom into his students. And then that helped to inspire the entire civil rights movement. And they also talk about, there's a place in Tennessee, it's called the Highlander Center, which is a school, which was started, I believe, in the 1930s it was by religious people, I believe. But they were open to socialists and communists. It was called the Highlander Center, and actually both King and Rosa Parks went to training events there. And that center has been under attack for decades, and it was burned down several times back during the civil rights movement, and actually it was burned down again about 2 weeks ago. It was attacked, and the office was burned down, and there were white nationalist symbols were painted on the sidewalk where it happened. So what we're talking about is ongoing. This is not just history. These are things that are going on right now. The civil rights movement was originally partially assisted and manipulated by Northern capitalists to facilitate a couple of things. On the one hand, there was a whole motion to industrialize the South, and in order to build industry in the South, it didn't make sense to have separate facilities when you had workers working side by side in the same factories. And another factor was the whole expansion of capital into the neo-colonial world. And in order to do that during this period, which was the period of the Cold War, they had to do something about the bad public relations which kept happening every time the civil rights movement was attacked by terrorists. So this movement spontaneously fought for full political equality and didn't stop when it when it got the legal equality, which I believe the capitalists wanted, that's where they wanted it to stop. But once it was unleashed, it continued, and it still continues today. But the government has ever since then worked hard since the 1970s to shut down what's left of the civil rights movement, the freedom movement of the African Americans, and begun to repress it through other means. And for example, I mean, people are familiar with the Black Panther Party and how it was, its leaders were assassinated and imprisoned by the government. But even more, I think people are also familiar with what's known as the new Jim Crow, which was used to just take the leaders of the African American community and ensnare them in this war on drugs, and to the point where today there's more people who are deprived of their right to vote by laws against felony voting than people who are deprived by the old Southern poll taxes and the Southern repression, the so-called Negro disenfranchisement. So it is still going on. One of the things which I think is important to understand about racism, and I hope I'm not going on too long here, but it's is that racism as a conscious ideology is, when we talk about racism, we have to distinguish between institutional racism, which is built into the system, and the ideology of individuals. And I think it's very important to understand that in terms of that, because there's a whole debate out there whether the American people are racist. And if we take the position that the American people are racist, it makes this problem insoluble. So it's very important not to fall into that. America has a serious problem with racism, history which I've just gone over with racism, and it has very serious racists. But to call the entire American people racist, that's actually racist itself, because not all people think the same way. And revolutionaries actually have to win American people over to an understanding of class and to a class position. And we can't do it if we start off by claiming that they're racist. Some whites have supported blacks at every stage of their freedom. You can go back to John Brown, and during the civil rights movement, there were whites. I know my family, there was a minister from Boston, which is where I'm from, who was beaten to death during the civil rights movement in 1965 in Selma. That had an impact on my family. So there have always been white people who have been involved in the freedom movement. And actually, the World War II shows that actually racism, what's called intercolor racism, and these are complicated, can actually be worse than white racism, because the word who's generally recognized as the worst racist in history was Adolf Hitler. But Adolf Hitler killed almost all white people. It was millions of white people that he killed. And the other major massacres that occurred during World War II were the massacres of the Chinese by the Japanese. So this is not just it's not a color question primarily. It's a question of the use of physical characteristics to justify genocide, murder, and exploitation. So racist ideology gets its foundation from the capitalist system, which survives by having its workers compete one against another. And the problem and the first step for a revolutionary, if we're interested in eliminating capitalism and eliminating racism, is to describe the real enemy. And the real enemy is the system. It's not white people per se. And in order to defeat the system, we have to unite as many people as possible of all colors to defeat that system. And with that, and if we have the idea that the American people are consciously racist, then we'll never be able to defeat capitalism. And if we can't defeat capitalism, we'll never be able to defeat racism. So we need to figure out the way to fight and develop class unity among ourselves. And that can only be done with consciousness and education, and that requires an organized group of people that are committed to doing that. The situation today is it's a very alarming situation. Basically, we're in a time when, I know Nayland gave me an article here, it says robots may steal as many as 800 million jobs in the next 13 years. We're in a time of radical economic transformation, where the capitalist system no longer needs, it is in the process of step by step, no longer needing human labor. And since they no longer need human labor, they make no provisions for keeping human beings alive. And in fact, they're step by step taking away the social safety net, taking away all government responsibility for keeping people alive. And they're also working on taking away our right to vote step by step. We've seen the Supreme Court decision overturning the Voting Rights Act. We've seen the gerrymandering that's going on. And basically, we're starting to see the introduction of a fascist dictatorship. And it's facilitated not just by the right, by the Trump people, but a lot of times it's also facilitated by the Democrats because of their failure to present class unity and class oppression. We've seen an example of this just recently in San Jose. I know Sharat and I were both at the Board of Supervisors on Tuesday. They had a resolution there whether the Santa Clara County has what they call a sanctuary policy, which was enacted because the people demanded it, that the county law enforcement will not turn people over to ICE, which is the immigration agency. And the reason they won't do it is because we know that ICE is an evil organization. It's organized to strip the rights of Latino people. And if you don't believe it, just listen to the words of the President of the United States. And the President, for example, has every intention of taking away the right to vote from Latinos and from taking away what he calls what is actually birthright citizenship, which was something that we fought for in the Civil War, the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. And ICE is going to be enforcing these fascist measures. So it's very important that we fight for our local officials not to turn people over to ICE for any reason. And that's what that was. And it was actually a very profound outpouring from the people of San Jose. It was about 5 or 6 or 7 to 1 of people who said, no, under no circumstances should we turn our people over to ICE, which was a real powerful repudiation of Donald Trump's message, which is that Latinos are coming to kill you. And he says that over and over again. And he's actually right now pledging to escalate that campaign because he's transforming his Homeland Security Agency because he thinks they're too soft on immigrants. So this is the situation we're in. We need to fight for unity, and we need to defend our immigrants. We need to defend all our people regardless of color, and we need to understand. I've been, for years, I've been a fighter for housing. I've also worked to a certain extent on healthcare, but you cannot win housing and you cannot win healthcare without unity, and you can't have unity as long as you allow discrimination. So that's why this whole question of fighting against racism and against racial oppression is central to the entire revolutionary process in the United States. So thank you very much.